Yeah, it took me a second.
Yeah.
You guys are live.
We're live!
Hi, everybody. I'm Annabelle.
I'm Nancy.
And welcome to, which course is this?
Course
This
2.
is course 2. No, I'm just kidding. I know exactly what course this is. This is writing the novel. And we are so pleased to have all of you on board with us.
Andrew's here. Why don't you put your hand
Andrew's
in?
here too. Yeah. Do you want to say hi? That's not your
There's
hand. That's your head.
Andrew.
Andrew and his headphones.
That was scary.
He's like a minion.
Just kind of sliding in there.
Sliding into the frame.
And to round out actually
Shake
our team here, we should mention that we have a new team member on board who you will be seeing in the discussions and online, and that is Shireen El-Banhawi, who is a alum of our outlining and writing the novel courses.
And also a current MFA student.
And
I'm sorry,
current,
you were going to
no,
say
that's
that.
okay. Is a current MFA student with us, and so she's going to be taking on a role of a bit of a sort of TA, yeah, and she'll be sort of helping collate questions as they come in. She'll be sort of moderating discussions a little bit, and it's just going to be another part of the team kind of working away to keep the course running. So big welcome and big shout out to Shireen. It's so great to have her on board. So apparently we have 18 of you who've come back on board after the outlining class. So that's fantastic to see. And we want to say a big hello to all the new students as well. We are so pleased to have the next 6 weeks with you as you work on your novels. This next paragraph was thrilling for me. I was just going to say, you're jumping on top of me every time. I'm almost there. I'm almost caught up with you. We have a super far-flung group of writers, and I always get a little thrill reading this bit. We have students from across the U.S., so Miami, Dallas, Seattle, Cambridge, all across Canada, Nova Scotia, Ontario, Saskatchewan, Alberta, and 11 of you from BC. Woo! We also have people from New Zealand and Australia, 7 of you, and the UK, 3 of you. Ireland, Norway, Netherlands, Switzerland, Italy. We have students from China, Malaysia, Indonesia, and I believe for the first time ever, Papua New Guinea. I have to say a special welcome to Papua New Guinea because I actually was so thrilled when I saw that. It's made my day. I was walking up and down the halls, just kind of smiling. It's like, we have a student in Papua New Guinea. The world is so huge and so small simultaneously.
It is.
It's thrilling. So some of you do have first drafts already in hand, and some of you have outlines from the first course, and some of you haven't done either, and that's okay. We really have tried to design this course to sort of meet you at whatever stage you're in, and hopefully, no matter how far advanced or not you are with your draft, you'll find something of use here to help you kind of get traction and dig into working on your novels.
And don't worry if you're in this course, but you haven't taken the theoretically first course, structure and outline, because you can take them in any order.
You absolutely
you're not going to feel left behind.
And one of the things that we actually learn in the structure and outline course is that many professional writers don't actually begin to implement an outline until they've begun some writing already. So we've had people take them in the reverse order too, just whatever works for you.
What about the genres, Anna?
And then we're getting to the genres. We have people writing sci-fi, YA, fantasy, speculative YA, memoir, historical fiction, literary fiction, all of the fictions, all of the genres.
Yes.
We love them all. No matter what you're interested in, this process is going to be the same, and the concerns are going to be the same. So it's really fantastic. Oh, we even have people who aren't writing in English. We have people writing in Swedish and Dutch. It is fantastic. I'm excited.
I'm so excited. And you've already done some hard work, which is very impressive. Some assignments even.
Yes. That's right. Some free writing happened this week.
Some free writing. We had some great assignments. I'm going to recap them quickly. We had several discussion topics, from introductions to free writing and third-person narration. And the free writing sparked a lot of discussion, as it always does.
It always does.
Sharing the angst and hopefully the revelation that you're all not alone in this tough and often exhilarating journey. I think it's a combination of both, right? Tough and exhilarating. Yeah. Quite a few of you found the free writing process liberating and even exciting, which is excellent. You put down more words than you expected, and sometimes even better words than you expected. Many people mentioned how free writing allowed them to subdue their inner critic. And I just picture somebody, tying their inner critic to a chair with a long piece of rope, their inner perfectionist, and just putting some words on the page, as well as how the exercise reminded them of why they wanted to write their novel in the first place. And I do think we lose sight of that as we move through the process of writing. At the same time, some of you faced anxieties and insecurities, uncomfortable truths about why you want to write a novel, whether it was because your motivations were unclear or you felt a conflict between what you want to write and what you feel you should write.
I feel that all the time.
Yes. Oh, it's terrible. I think I did for a long time, and now I've just embraced the fact that I'm just going to write what I want to write because life is too short to write something I don't actually want to write.
That's true.
Yeah.
That's true.
And you worried about rejection. Who doesn't worry about rejection, right? And whether people might find your book inauthentic, sentimental, or think less of you because of it. I was just at a conference in Alberta over the weekend, and that's one of the things we talked about is like that fear of judgment that people will have about you reading your novels. Like, oh, I didn't know you were this kind of person. So that, I think it's a very common fear.
You worry, and yet people manage to completely discount the awe with which people arrive going, holy crap, you wrote a novel.
Yeah.
Like it could be a completely crappy novel, but oh
that
my
you
goodness,
did it.
what it took you to get to that point. So don't underplay to yourself the kudos you will get from your friends and family just for completing the project.
You worried about never finishing your book and what you didn't want your book to be. I think those are important things to think about. But in terms of never finishing your book, that's something that you have complete control over. Yes.
And we will have tools to help you get through the stickier parts.
Yes. And the thing to remember is this is all completely normal. One of the reasons that we have the free writes at the start is to let some of these thoughts come out and get them onto the page, get the words flowing. At this point in the writing process, we want you to work to really still and quiet any overly critical voices, because you know what? In the process of writing the draft, these voices are not helpful at all. They'll come in handy later when you're rewriting and editing, but for now, let's just keep them quiet. Do you want to share some of what our students said?
Sure. So Mia said, once I discovered free writing, my productivity increased. The inner critic went on holiday for a short while, and the words I produced actually weren't as terrible as I thought they would be. I expect that my first draft will need to be produced in short 20-minute bursts so as to trick the critic into staying away long enough to get the job done. It's helpful for me to understand this about myself.
I love that image. Instead of the inner critic being tied to a chair, he's got his suitcase and he's wearing a Hawaiian shirt and he's got his hat on and he's
got a little drink with an umbrella and he's like, oh, I'll catch you later. I'll catch you around draft 5 or something.
Denise D.E. Emerson too said, I was pleasantly surprised that I not only enjoyed a lot this exercise, but I wrote more than the required 5 minutes. A great way to get over procrastination, that free writing.
You know what that reminds me of is when you're learning to become a runner, and there are those days when you just really don't want to go run. And the trick there is to say to yourself, okay, I'm not going for a run today. I'm going to put my shoes on, but I'm not going to go for a run. And then it's like, I'm going to open the front door. I'm not going for a run. I got my shoes on and I open the front door. Well, I'm just going to walk to the end of the block and back. That's not running. That's just, and then once you're out the door, you're off.
That's a great idea.
That's the 5 minutes. And I found that works for me too. If you say, well, I'm only doing 5 minutes, I'm not doing more. Yeah. Once you start, suddenly the ball's rolling and you're underway.
I think that's a great way to think about it. Just tell yourself you're just going to do, who can't do 5 minutes? Who can't find 5 minutes? Right. And then once you start, remembering where I got the idea for this book from got me all hyped about writing again. And it's important, I think, to continually go back to that, to go back to your original inspiration. Maybe you saw somebody somewhere and it made you think something. Maybe you heard a piece of music. Maybe you had an interaction with a person, or maybe somebody told you about something in your family. Going back to that point is always a great way to motivate yourself, especially when you're through the long slog of the middle of writing your novel.
And then Denise ended with that great quote.
Yes. So this is a quote from Louis L'Amour. Start writing no matter what. The water does not flow until the faucet is turned on.
Very true.
Very good, Louis L'Amour.
Yes. I like that one.
And then we had our third person narration assignment, and there were lots of great insights here. Okay, shall I jump in? Yeah. Many of you found this exercise challenging. The descriptors limiting. You wondered whether a narrative voice could have contradictory aspects, and if some authors used contradictory elements on purpose to engage readers. Could a narrative voice be intimate and distant, detached and emotional? Also, some of you weren't sure about how to define high and low status. Was it based on financial status, and how could you tell? And if someone is street smart, this is Lois's question, would that make him educated or not? Several of you felt that it was difficult to decide on the education level. So I think the important thing to clarify here is these descriptors are simply a way for you to tune in to the voice. So whatever works for you. So you might have, you might distinguish between street smart versus book smart.
Mm-hmm.
This is a voice that sounds really street smart. This is a voice that sounds really book smart. In terms of status, you can interpret it any way you want. You can say financial status. Here is somebody who is a working class guy who's really struggling to pay his rent. Here is somebody who's part of the 1% who lives in a $10 million mansion. Or you could decide it has to do with social dynamics. Let's say you've got a ballet school. Yeah, where somebody is the prima ballerina and somebody is the struggling, barely making it in the ballet school. That would be a huge difference in status. So you can define these terms in any way you want, as long as it tunes you into those subtle differences between characters and between voices.
Yeah, I mean, status for me is all about how the character feels about the world in which they find themselves. Do I feel that I have power? Do I feel that I have agency? Do I feel that I have autonomy? Do I feel that I have independence? Do I feel that I have control over my life? Or do I feel that those things are sort of infringed and encroached on? And if so, how? So status, it's not a sort of black and white, right or wrong. No, you didn't understand what we meant by. It's more, what do you mean in the context of your book? Like, what does status mean in the world that you're creating?
So if you were to set your novel in the world of hedge fund managers, all who earn in the 7 to 8 digits a year, even amongst that group of elite earners, there would be status.
Oh, yeah.
There would be some people who are lower status and there are people who are higher status. So I think you can think of status in whatever ways make sense. Most of you found the best way to understand the narrative voice is by looking closely at the language.
Excellent.
Excellent. Yes. Economy, similes, metaphors, irony, and the sentence structures, length, simple, complex, elegant, and the word choices, vocabulary, preposition,
diction. Yeah.
Exactly. That is exactly what you should be looking at, how the writer is creating that sense of voice through those tiny, tiny choices that you're making.
These people. I don't think we've had another class catch on this earlier.
I know. Yeah. Very well done. Do you want to continue on?
Sure. So a lot of people looked at Americana, Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie's novel, and talked about how lyrical and smooth the view of the protagonist was, how her elegant formal voice conveyed how educated she was, and yet an outsider. And for those of you who haven't read it, this is a Nigerian character who comes to study at college in the US and, you know, is extremely well educated, very intelligent, very articulate, and regularly has people come up to her saying, "Oh, your English is so good." It's like if English is the language of Nigeria. So, you know, she's dealing with stuff like this, where she's constantly being sort of misjudged and misinterpreted, and
having things projected on her based on how she looks.
Several of you talked about the contrast between the matter-of-fact yet ironic point of view in Indian Killer, and how the language was curt, crisp, and blunt, coming out, and this is a great quotation from Christine Elaine, like spurts of blood from a wound.
Oh,
yes.
I love it.
Yes, it's Christine's. You can't have it.
Okay.
In looking at All the Light We Cannot See, there was also a discussion of a narrative transition. The narrative seems to be impersonal and distant at first, and then becomes more personal as the predicament of the protagonist becomes apparent. How the narrative voice is quiet and subdued. That's Deborah Kennedy's description. Several of you talked about the way the description in this passage is so important. It puts us in the room with the protagonist because of those concrete sensory details.
Yeah. And I think it's a great observation about this idea of the narration beginning as impersonal and distant and then moving closer into the character as we connect with their situation. That's a very common technique.
Yeah.
And it's a way that you can show something of the larger picture of the scene and then bring us down into that intimate experience of the character.
And that comes back to what some of the comments that we had at the outset, where people were talking about the sort of the contradictory aspects of the narrative.
That's how a voice would be distant and
simultaneously.
Yeah. I mean, it definitely has some flexibility. Although what I will say in that regard is that generally, once you've honed down to that character's intimate experience, you don't leave that. So
It'd be hard.
You're not going to be
yeah.
telescoping in and out of the scene. You're going to be setting the picture and then coming closer right in with the character. And then we're going to stay with the character for the whole scene. Yeah.
Do you want to do the writing stuff?
Yeah. So it was exciting to see all the story beginnings that you posted. And it's good to see people are commenting and encouraging each other. And we encourage you to continue to do so. If you haven't yet, there are still some excerpts without comments. And it's so interesting because I'm actually taking another online course. I'm taking a course as a student.
I did not know that.
And it's been a long time since I've been a student in class. And it's the first time I've been a student in an online class. And I tell you, the moment you see that someone has commented on your work, there's a little bit of like, whoo, feeling to it. So I think it's important to make sure you spread it around and that, take a look and you can look in the thread to see how many comments there are on each person's thing. If you see someone who doesn't have any comments, go in there and make a comment.
Yeah, it's like going over and sitting next to the person in the cafeteria who's at a table by themselves.
Yeah. Right? At this early stage, encouragement is so important. It's key. So, these are words and fresh ideas that they're fragile still. Yeah. They're just the beginnings of ideas, really. So I wouldn't focus on critical feedback. We're all pretty critical about our own work. And I think if anybody's like me, when they post something, they're like, well, this is probably garbage, but I'm just going to post it because I have to. And so it's important to be encouraging. And one of the things you can do is focus on what are the parts that you really connected with. Like this really stood out for me, or this really painted a picture for me, or this word really evoked everything I needed to know. That's what you want to be doing rather than being critical.
Yeah, it doesn't make sense at this stage that in the way in which we've said, set aside your own internal critic. You're not doing other people favors. It's like they've brought to you their little science project in a plant pot. And it's like, look, I've got a little wee tiny pea shoot. And you go, wow, that's ugly. Like, no, no crushing each other's pea shoots.
That's not going to feed anybody. Yeah.
No, I mean, that's not, this is the wrong stage. Later on, you get to prune, right? When it's, I don't know, do you prune peas? I don't think you prune peas.
No, you just
let's pretend it's a little privet hedge or something. Anyway, later on, there will be a time for that, both, you looking at your own work with that critical eye and also letting other people in with a more critical eye. But right now, I think encouragement and sort of, that sounds almost Pollyannish, and we don't mean it that way. It's not just sort of, oh my God, you're so amazing, but it's more, what am I responding to as a reader? Because that's really helpful information, I think, for the writer to know. Oh, wow, I didn't realize that the grandmother character was so interesting to people. Well, maybe I'll write more about her then.
I think
it's helpful.
I think it's really helpful. And I think the guidelines for giving feedback are based on also a more general guideline for working on your novel, which is if you've got a draft in progress, don't give it to people for criticism.
No.
It is I think it's the most dangerous thing you can do. Mm. And I have seen so many students and writers just wipe out in terms of their novel draft because even if you get positive feedback from a lot of people, it takes you in so many different directions. You become confused yourself about what the book is. So my advice to students is always do not show people a first draft in progress, ever. Write it, get to the end, know what it is. That's when you get feedback on it. That's when you get criticism.
That makes sense. What about the quotas? There's a very wide range on display of writing quotas that you've set for yourselves, as there should be. We want you all to consider your own particular circumstances, how busy your life is, what your productivity typically is, and just what you can realistically fit in. My personal quota was always 200 words. I felt like if I had a little bit of time to write and I got 200 words done, good. That was good for me.
Mine would always start super small, and then increase. So my first writing day be like 50 words. If I can get 50 words down in a document, I'm good. I've done it. Next day, 100 words, and then the next week might be 200 words, and then that might go on for a little while. And then once you get that momentum going, you can if you find that you can get your 200 words done in the first half hour, and you've got an hour set aside, guess what? You can push yourself harder. You can bump up your quota, just like with running. You can run a little further each day. Yeah.
Moving on to the questions.
Yeah.
Do you want to do the first one?
Sure. Janer1.2x has a question about telling versus showing. If you belong to a writer's group, there's always someone who cries, too much telling. Or if you Google agents, it seems to be their biggest generic bugbear. too much telling and not enough showing. It's something I dread, even though I've been writing for years, and I think it may be a function of the POV. I'm using the first person in my police procedural mainly because I want it to be fast-paced and pull the reader in very quickly. I find if I try the third person limited or third person omniscient, it feels like all telling to me, and then I go overboard with the descriptors in an attempt to show.
I have a couple of reactions to
Yeah.
that. My first reaction is there's actually, and this will maybe seem a little off topic, but there's a really interesting article which you can find quite easily by Ocean Vuong, the poet, about showing versus telling, and why that's sort of a convention that maybe needs to be looked at a little bit. We're used to throwing it around, that term in creative writing workshops, but there's a time and a place for telling, and it's maybe, we shouldn't just sort of take it on all on board, sort of completely like that.
I think that both have their.
You've read the same piece,
yeah.
Right?
I don't know if I read that piece, but I do think that both of them have their function.
Yeah.
That showing is focused on concrete sensory detail, and it's what paints the world and the situation and the emotional reality in the reader's mind. It's what makes us feel like we're there. Telling is what helps us make sense of it, and it's a balance. It's like if it was a recipe, I'd say 80% showing and 20% telling, but that 20% telling is doing a lot of hard work for you. I think when you hear too much telling, it's generally because you've done too much summary. You're summarizing the events, you're explaining them to us, and we're not experiencing them. We're getting a second-hand or third-hand account of the events that have happened to the character.
But I also feel like that's not particular to the third person. Like I wouldn't avoid using the third person, particularly third person limited, because you're afraid that you're going to slip into telling, because that's more aesthetic choices that you're making within the third person. And there's ways to avoid that. I mean, one of the tricks that I played with myself when working on an earlier piece that was in third person limited was I decided I was going to write it like a screenplay. So I would only describe, it helped that this character was a bit of a sociopath, but I would only describe what you could see her doing and how she was moving through the world and what she saw. But we didn't really have a lot of interior access. So she wasn't able to sort of give us a lot of, she realized that blah, 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 blah. We couldn't go into these sort of, out of the present moment passages that I think people fear a little bit with this showing and telling.
Yeah.
So there's tricks that you can play on yourself, and I don't think third person is worth avoiding just because of this fear.
Well, I think you're exactly right. Like I don't think showing and telling are actually related to POV. I think they're completely separate things to consider. And I think you want to choose the POV that makes the most sense in terms of the storytelling that you want to do.
Yeah.
And in terms of the ease of your own writing, choose the POV that you're most connected with, and then think about how to evoke the scenic moments in your novel through concrete sensory detail rather than through explanation. If you're writing a police procedural, I'll tell you right now, I know one of the huge pitfalls in writing procedurals is that you as the author feel like, well, I need to back up this truck and dump this information on the reader because the reader needs to know how all of these things happen. And the reality is you can assume a level of intelligence on the part of your reader. Most readers have been exposed to countless procedurals already. They're very familiar with all the tropes. And so you can rely on the details that really bring your particular story to life rather than having to explain, it's like that old CSI Miami, what are you doing? Well, Horatio, I'm performing an autopsy, which is where I examine the body for the cause of death. And it's like, who doesn't know that that's what an autopsy is? So you can think about why you're falling into telling. That would be the question. If you feel like you're landing too hard on the side of telling, ask yourself why. What are those telling passages doing?
Yeah.
Are they conveying too much internal stuff for the character, like it's all the thinking and feeling?
Or is it incorporation of research? In the case of a police procedural, maybe you feel like you have to describe, what's going on in the pathologist's lab.
Yeah.
We're going to have more on research in week 5, but there are ways around that.
Yes. So ask why. That would be my advice.
Yes. Deborah says, confused about third person limited versus third person POV. I really like this week's material, especially the stuff about narrative voice. I'm wondering if you can clarify something I was confused about. I'm trying to write a novel following one main character, but part of a large family, and I'm attempting a third-person limited point of view.
Okay.
I had just assumed that in the third-person limited, the narrative voice would come from the main character. In other words, it's her thoughts, her observations, her personality. Is this correct? Is this typical? Maybe I'm not understanding this type of POV.
That is correct and typical, and you are understanding it exactly.
And then she goes on, is there a distinct difference between third-person point of view and third-person limited point of view? And if I am correct and the narrative voice is the main character, is it possible to go away from the main character? In other words, have scenes without the main character in them?
Okay, so the difference, so third-person POV is like the overarching descriptor of what the POV is. Third-person limited and third-person omniscient are two types of third-person narration. So it's not so much that there's a difference between them, it's just adding a further delineation, or like it's a subset. Does that make sense? So when you have third person, you could have third person limited, where we stay with one character all the time, or you could have third person omniscient, where we move from this character to that character to that character all in one scene. So
that's clear if you say third person limited and third person unlimited, which is basically what omniscient is.
Yes,
right?
Exactly.
Where you have unlimited access to all of the characters, whereas with limited, and this comes back to her second question, you only have access to that character. So if you're in a single third person limited point of view, your question is, can you then show stuff that's happening where they're not in the scene? No, you cannot. What you can do is have a shifting third person limited if you're going into the head of more than one character, but while you're in that character, you're staying limited inside that character. And then you can capture those scenes. So like you have your protagonist A, protagonist B, antagonist, and maybe we're sort of looking at all of those points of view. But, you know, let's say that we're going chapter by chapter and they're taking their turn each. So when we're in protagonist A, it's third person limited protagonist A. When we're in protagonist B, it's third person limited protagonist B. So they can do stuff where A isn't there, but they can't do anything where they themselves are not there.
Yeah, exactly.
Is this?
Yeah, absolutely. So let's say there's a bomb at a train station, and Nancy, Annabelle, and Andrew are the three characters who were there when it happened. Chapter 1 is from Nancy's point of view. This is Nancy's perspective. Chapter 2 is from Annabelle's point of view. This is Annabelle's perspective. Chapter 3 is Andrew. And then we alternate back and forth. Then you go back to Nancy, go back to Andrew, go back to Annabelle.
So that the bit where Andrew left the suitcase and nobody saw him, we can't tell that bit. Only Andrew can tell
Only Andrew, yeah, exactly. So that's one way. But if you're saying that every single thing in the novel is from your character's point of view, except this one scene, that is something that you have to find a different technical way to solve, because you can't just shift point of view for one scene in a whole novel. It doesn't make sense. And what will happen if you do that is that the person reading the manuscript will say, well, this is not a very technically proficient writer because they didn't even try to solve this problem.
It's jarring because your reader at that point is not reading your book anymore. They're sitting back and thinking about the technical questions.
Yeah.
They're yanked right out of the story.
Yeah. So you want to think about how you can convey that scene in a different way. Now, it might be retrospective, like it might be like later on, Sally would find out that
Alice Munro's the master of that. She does
that kind of technique. Or you may think about whether or not you need that scene at all. Yeah. So I would think about the fact that if you're going to do third person limited for 99.5% of your entire novel, you want to do it for that last 0.5% too.
Yes. The next question from Natalie kind of follows on, looking at the distinction between, or moving between third person limited and third person omniscient. In the advantages and disadvantages of the various points of view, it was noted that third person limited allows you to move easily from point of view to point of view. How is this different from third person omniscient? So I think we kind of just touched on that.
Yeah, third person omniscient would be in a scene, you get my point of view while I was talking to Annabelle, and then Annabelle's point of view as she was talking to me. And then when Andrew joined us for coffee in the same scene, we get Andrew's point of view. This would all be happening in one scene.
Sort of a free floating, hovering, like godlike.
It's moving all the time, constantly changing, could be changing line by line. Whereas in third person limited, if we were alternating points of view, when it was in my point of view, it would stay in my point of view for the entire section or chapter. And then it would move to Annabelle's point of view and stay in her point of view. So we wouldn't be bouncing back and forth, getting various character internal experiences as you do in an omniscient POV.
take a look. There's a Mary Gaitskell short story that I think you can find it online legally and for free if you Google, called The Arms and Legs of the Lake. And it's also in her collection called Don't Cry. And it's a perfect example of shifting third-person limited POV, where she's got a bunch of people riding in a train car, and I think a crime happens or something, and you move from one person's POV to the next, to the next, to the next, and within a short story, she's got about a dozen points of view.
But we're limited once
we're limited by scene. Each scene is sort of chunked off from the next one, and it's a very classic use of that roving third-person limited POV. Whereas an omniscient would be
Bonnie Bernard's Casino, which is a classic Canadian short story where it's the story of a casino burning down, and basically the narration is just flitting in and out of characters' minds constantly. And it's kind of like a disembodied experience, but the idea is that you end up getting the experience of the entire community.
And then Natalie's had a sort of question that was more specific to her own work. My novel is a relationship or family dramedy.
Yeah.
So character and relationships between characters are paramount. Is there a point of view most suited to this genre? And then how much character interiority other than the protagonist can I access with third person limited? Characters other than my protagonist have arcs and B plots. If I go with third person limited, do these arcs and plots have to be experienced through my protagonist?
Okay, so let me answer the first question. There is no connection between POV and genre.
No.
It is purely a decision in terms of what is best for the story you want to tell and how you want to tell it. So when you think of these characters, if you go back and read the material on first person, ask yourself, do you want to take on what writing multiple first person characters will entail? That is a pretty hefty technical challenge. You have to make every voice distinct. You have to make every voice really drive the character. So there's a lot of kind of technical pressure on that. If you decide to do third person limited, you've got some flexibility. You've got a bit more flexibility there. You can have a similar narrative voice for the entire book, or you can choose to calibrate each third person narration towards the character, the sound of the character. But that choice is based on what you want to do with the novel, what you feel more comfortable. If you're almost like a character actor yourself, like you're like, I like to do this voice and then I like to do that voice, then maybe the first person is the right one for you. But if you feel like, no, I want the book to have more of a cohesive sound and I want to shift in and out of the characters, then third person would work better. In terms of interiority, you can have as much interiority as you want if you've got other main characters essentially in your novels. That is, they each have their own subplot and we're going to be in their thoughts and feelings. You can go as interior as you like, and you're not beholden to the main character.
Here's a question about omniscient point of view.
Yep.
You have to repeat it, probably.
Okay.
Andrew's going to read us the question from online, and then we're going to repeat it.
Denise Emerson asks, can I have a narrator as an omniscient POV and then have him or her enter the story as a character at some point, like deep in Act 2 or 3?
So the question is, can I have an omniscient point of view and then have that omniscient character enter the story as a character later? For me, that would be like a god entering the story, or some kind of supernatural being, or, alien with magical powers who can see into other people's minds and then enters the story themselves.
Psychic?
A psychic. It's a particular kind. Now, I'm not saying that in any kind of
prescriptive,
sardonic or dismissive way. Like, I can imagine a character where a god enters. It's ancient Greek drama that happens all the time. But you have to be aware that that's the effect that it's going to have.
For me, it brings to mind, I can't remember what film it was, but there is a film where Morgan Freeman is narrating and he's God, and it is omniscient, right? It's like he's narrating the experience of the character. Joe felt this way. Joe thought this. The thing about omniscience is, like you say,
Kieslowski's Decalogue as well. That Polish film director, he did a series of 10 short films. Based on the 10 Commandments, and there is a character who returns in each one, a guy in a white suit, and I think you're supposed to understand he's God, but his attitude in each one is very different. At one point he's sort of turned away, at one point he's watching some children and laughing, and he's sort of engaged differently. I mean, it's not a literary example, it's a film example, but there's a bit of an example of how you might have an embodied omniscient character in a film.
But I guess what we're saying is, Somebody who is an omniscient narrator who then shows up in the story cannot just be a regular person, because a regular person does not have access to other people's thoughts and feelings. And I mean, we think on this all the time as fiction writers. As people, the only people in the world that we have access to the thoughts and feelings of is ourselves. No matter how close we are to another person, we do not have access to their thoughts and feelings. So that's why having a character appear who was the omniscient narrator means they have to have some kind of super otherworldly power.
Or it's like magic realism or something like that too. Yeah. I've lost track of where we are.
I think we're at
3. No, we're on 4.
My novel, 4. 4, yeah.
Do you want to read this one?
Yes. Mia Clapton. Tenses. One more question to add on tenses. We haven't even started with tenses yet. I'm also struggling with tenses. My novel has 3 narrative lines, 2 in the present tense, 1 in the past. What are the options for tackling tense in stories told in different timelines?
All the options. You have all the options. Again, tense is not, they're not hard and fast rules, other than that you want to choose. It has to make sense. You want to choose what's going to be appropriate to the story that you're telling. So if you're cutting back between 2 timelines where one's told by, a grandchild in the 2000s, and then you've got a World War II timeline told by the grandmother, maybe you're telling the present tense one in the present tense and the past tense one in the past tense. Or maybe you flipped it the other way around for some, aesthetic reason that you've chosen. But as long as it makes sense internally to the story, it really is up to you. I mean, that's a call you're going to have to make.
I think the thing that a lot of writers forget when it comes to tense is that you have to be mindful of the fact that a reader is going to read your novel. And the function of tense is a signal to the reader. It's helping them either ground themselves in a place or understand this happened before that thing that I just explained to you, or this happened after that thing that I just explained to you. Or in the case of, if you want to flip, if you want to say the grandmother in World War II is set in the present tense, what you're telling the reader there is, I want you to ground yourself here with this character. When I tell you about the granddaughter in the 2000s, we're moving to we're using this as our kind of focal point, and then we're moving out to that point. So it really depends on what you want to do with your story.
I think the tenses have different emotional kind of temperatures too.
Yeah.
You get maybe more immediacy with present tense, but you get a more sort of rational, retrospective, cool and considered look with past tense, where it's like, I've had a chance to think about these events that happened in the past, and I'm going to tell you about them, as opposed to, this is happening to me right now and it's really intense and I just have no way to interpret it, but I'm just going to here it is.
Yes.
That's present tense.
Yeah. Me. And then she goes on to ask, also for narrative line in the past, how do I deal with memories that are even further in the past? Well, I think this is tricky. That there's a couple of things you need to remember here. If it's its own narrative line, it can just be in the regular past tense. It's like it's not like you have to have a past and then a further past and then an even further past. We can just say it's like one narrative line was from 1920 and one narrative line is from 1820. They can both just be said in the past tense. Put the date, maybe put 1820 at the beginning of your chapter. And guess what? The reader knows exactly where you are. You don't have to do all the signaling in the text itself. The one thing I will caution here is, do not have a character have a memory in which they have a memory. That is something that defies logic and consciousness. We don't have memories of having memories. So, you want to be careful about this idea of how you're building these pasts.
There might be an occasion where you need a little bit of past perfect, and that's, I had done this, I had read that book, as opposed to I read that book.
Yeah.
And that's really when you're not moving sort of from chapter to another chapter that's earlier, or a scene to another scene, but you're doing it within. So you're saying, when I got home that night, the kitchen was cold and I couldn't smell food. Earlier that day, I had bought groceries and left them out for my daughter to cook dinner, and she obviously hadn't done it. So there, you see the had is slipping in there, because I'm describing a sequence of events that are complete and closed and finished within under a larger umbrella of an existing past tense. And you would only use that very briefly.
You would only use that briefly, and you can also kind of signal that and then move out of it. So, I was riding down the road when I went to visit my grandma. She had been a nurse in the Second World War. And if you want to go into some detail about that, you can drop the hads at a certain point and just leave us in simple past, and then signal a return by having another had, another pluperfect.
Like little bookends.
Yeah.
But I would say, I mean, she says, my head is spinning. Help. Relax for this, first couple of drafts. Just let it come out the way that it comes, and it'll probably be more coherent than you think it will. If you have a major, what you're thinking of as a mistake, you might have shifted at one point in a scene. Okay, you started in past, but then you found you moved to present, and you stayed in present. And then it's going to be a simple decision of, okay, so which of these is working better for my scene? And then you just go back and adjust. But don't let it get too complicated. It doesn't have to be. It's just overall what suits it. Read it out loud and you'll get a good sense.
I think reading it out loud is really good. And also, if you notice changes in the tense, just asking yourself why. Why does the tense change here specifically?
Tamara has questions about tense. I start in present tense, but quickly move to the past, which does not last for more than 2 sentences. Go back to the present, speak briefly of the future. Then I have the narrative voice in full present tense for the most part. I dip into what the character will learn later, so a version of the future, and finally end in a sort of summary that blends present with the very recent past. This is my opening scene. I'm trying it out as the opening scene anyway, but chronologically, this scene occurs at the Act 1 climax. So the reader reads this scene, goes back in time 6 weeks, then travels forward through all of Act 1 to this scene, and then moves forward from there in the middle of the book. Do you foresee any problems?
Well, in terms of your opening, I mean, I'm just trying to imagine this. I mean, I feel like I can imagine it quite easily. For instance, if I was narrating this moment, I would say, I'm sitting here with Annabelle and Andrew, and we're having this Google Hangout. 10 minutes before this, I was back in my office working on some emails. And after the Hangout, I'm hoping to go get something to eat because I'm pretty hungry, and I think I'm going to do that. So that was me moving from the present to the past to the future. I don't think you should worry about tense in this kind of way. I think you should just ask yourself, does the text itself make sense? If the text makes sense, if you can read it aloud to another person and they say, yeah, I understand what you were saying, then I think it's fine. I don't think you should worry about too many. I mean, jumps in tense are natural. If we're going to talk about the past or we're going to talk about the future, then that makes sense, right?
But then there's a structural question, which the opening scene chronologically occurs at the Act 1 climax. So you're taking a bit of your Act 1 climax, plucking it out and using that as your opening. And then presumably moving away from it and then coming back to that at the climax. Now that is going to be a challenge.
Yeah,
I kind of feel a little iffy about that.
That structurally is going to be a challenge, and I'll tell you why. It's not uncommon to see the actual crisis point of a novel hinted at.
Kind of sampled at the beginning.
Yeah, exactly. Sampled at the beginning of a novel. But to have the Act 1 climax sampled at the beginning means that you're removing all the tension in terms of whether or not, coming to know what the Act 1 climax will be.
Because remember what an Act 1 climax is. It's your character making a decision. And so all the way leading up to that, it's like, what are they going to do? What are they going to do? And if I already know from page 1, this is what they're going to do, I'm going to be like, okay, where's Act 2? I'm going to just start there.
But not just that. I think if you know what the decision is, it's also deflating the tension. Then I'm like, well, why am I reading the rest of these pages if I already know they're going to have to make this decision? Unless there's some huge reversal there, unless the scene that you show of the Act 1 climax is giving us a false representation of what the Act 1 climax will be. Like the idea, it's a camera shot like this, but when you pull back
to reveal
to the actual Act 1 climax, it's like, oh, this is not at all what I thought it would be. That would be the only way that could work structurally.
Yeah, but you risk, as Nancy says, really kind of disappointing your reader by deflating the tension if you give too much too soon.
I'll tell you, one of the things that writers always say is I want to start with a real hook, a real grabber, and then I'll get into the actual story. And that was the one thing that when we talked to agents, especially, they talked about, they don't like prologues. They don't like that because what it does is you get past those first couple of pages that were really exciting, and then everything else falls off. The key to a great novel is nothing falls off ever. And so that's what you want to think about. If you've got some juicy Act 1 climax, then maybe it's about thinking about what's your inciting incident and what can you do to maybe create the stakes there and have a real conflict leading from the inciting incident to the act one.
Yeah, it should be juicy all the way through. Do you want to
like a good peach.
Yeah.
Number 6, Leslie Alex. I'm shocked about how confused I get by the basic problem of tenses. Are you sensing a theme this week?
There is a theme this week.
I originally wrote the first few chapters of my book in a diary format. Then I changed to first person present. But I have started the book, quote unquote, 3 things I'm scared of, etc. So it's like she's got lists as a little device. Yeah. Then I talk about the day in the past. Today, Mother and I drove to Palmerston in a lightning storm. Actually, now I'm explaining it to you. I am explaining it to you. I see. I wrote in the past tense for a while. Then I changed to the present tense and I don't know what I'm doing. So then she includes an example. And we've got a diary entry that's written all in the present tense. And then we've got a list that's written. It's a list, so I don't even know it matters what tense it's in. So my impulse reading this diary entry was that maybe the present tense wasn't working as well, but I don't know.
Really?
Did you like the present tense?
I thought this was charming. I really like this.
So see, it's a matter of taste.
Hang on. Is this a diary entry though?
It is.
No, she says originally she wrote the first few chapters as diary format, but then changed to first person
but
present.
I assumed that. See, I was confused. I assumed you meant.
You thought subsequent.
Yes.
And I went back and redid that.
Okay.
So if this was as a diary entry, yeah, it's artificial to have it
in the present tense.
In the present tense, but as a
narration,
as just a first person narrative.
Yes,
I thought this was lovely.
There you go. So I guess for me, the reason the diary entry in the present tense feels a bit weird is because you write a diary after things have already happened. You don't write a diary as things are happening. Like even if you're running back to your room to record the heat of the moment, you would say, Mom just did this, and then Dad said this, and so to me, the conceit of a diary entry almost demands the past tense. Yeah. But as you're saying, if it were just narration, then the present tense would work fine. Yes.
Yeah. All right, Christine Elaine, opening a novel with multiple narrative lines.
Okay.
She says, "Hi there. My novel has 2 separate narrative lines, and I'm wondering if the rules around the contents of the carry-on apply to each separate narrative. As in, should I start each narrative as if it was the only opening in the book, or do I not throw so much at the reader with the introduction of the second narrative?"
I would say, if you're going to do the best job you can, you would do a carry-on for both. They might be different carry-ons. They might be contrasting carry-ons. They might have a different tone and different feel. But I think that if you're going to start a whole new narrative line, we do need to know some basic information about the story.
I agree. I think it's going to be a little bit context dependent though.
Yeah.
Because if you are doing, for instance, one storyline that's set in the 1990s and one that's set in the 1790s, complete carry on for each, because they're completely different worlds.
Yes.
If I have 2 storylines, 2 friends taking the same course at university, they're both at UBC, they're both taking psychology or something.
Yes.
And it's a sort of he said, she said kind of story. Do I need to pack the same carry-on with the same info again? Like, we're still in Vancouver, guys. We're still at UBC, guys. Yeah. I'm going to introduce UBC to you as though you've never seen it before. Well, I just saw it in the previous chapter. So there, I think it's a little context dependent. And depending on the nature of the second storyline, you might get away with a little bit of a lighter one. But she does have a second sort of follow-up question, which is, more specifically, do I aim for that knock 'em out opening in both, or can the second be a slower, easier opening? Which is a slightly different question.
That is a different question. I mean, I think contrast in terms of tone, atmosphere, approach is never a bad thing. Contrast itself is a punch, right? That we read one like woo opening, and then the next one is like, that contrast is already going to create a kind of tension and excitement for the reader. So I think that's fine. But the question is, I always feel like one of the questions people have around novel writing is like, is it okay to include the boring parts here? And the reality is you don't put the boring parts anywhere.
No, it's not okay.
As long as it has something that gives it momentum, you can certainly try a different style, atmosphere, approach, but that doesn't mean it can be boring. Like that doesn't mean you can go on for 30 pages doing a character study that goes nowhere. it means that you're just going to start with a different sort of feel to it.
And really the effect is going to be that you're creating different characterizations. Because if you start with a really intense kind of in your face, full on opening for one, and then the next opening is more kind of laid back and relaxed and slower paced, we're necessarily going to inflect some of that or
onto the
impose
character.
some of that onto the character. But when you say slower, easier for the reader, not necessarily easier for the writer.
Yes, absolutely.
Right? Because
absolutely.
you're still trying to create a particular effect.
Yes.
The next question is for you because I do not use Scrivener.
Okay.
This is a Scrivener question.
Do you want to ask it then?
Sure.
Okay.
Is Scrivener a good tool for working? This is from Vicky Jones 55. Is Scrivener a good tool for a work in progress in terms of keeping everything in one place? Research notes, alternate chapter versions. How do you use it?
Okay.
I do not use it, but these two do. So
But
the
we
wonderful
don't have several hours.
No, the wonderful thing about Scrivener is that it has tutorials. So it in itself will guide you through how to use it. I love it as a tool in terms of, I get really frustrated working with folders and documents because I find they become unwieldy very quickly. And especially if you don't want to write your novel chronologically page by page, which I often do not want to do. I don't want to just write page 1 and page 2 and page 3. Sometimes I want to write something that's way in chapter 5. And I don't even know it's called chapter 5. It's chapter something in the middle. Chapter later.
Yes.
So I find the best part of Scrivener for me is the fact that you can organize things and move them around really easily and see what everything is, which you cannot do with Word documents and folders. Well, I mean, I guess you can, but you have to have multitudes of folders. But there's no kind of hierarchy. You've got files and folders. That's 2 levels of hierarchy. In Scrivener, you've got many levels. I love it. It's not for everyone, and I wouldn't spend your writing time learning how to use it, but free time on the weekend, I would definitely download the free trial. I don't own any shares in Scrivener. I scribe it out. Andrew uses Scrivener too.
I do.
So if you're organizationally challenged like I am and need to have that sense of sequencing and order, then it's good.
I just use one big honking Word document.
I got so tired of scrolling up and down through large Word documents. That's why I went to Scrivener.
And my Word documents would corrupt. Like at a certain point, like a 300-page mark, it's like all of a sudden they would just be buggy, and I'd have to resave them and resave. God, drove me crazy.
There you have it.
Your mileage may vary.
Your mileage may vary. These are personal testimonials only. Talia.
Red Butterfly said that Scrivener 3 on the Mac spots adverbs.
Oh,
you know what? I too spot adverbs.
She does. She
in
really,
my great big Word document.
She really does. Talia Z asked the following question. Dear Nancy and Annabelle, I'm so excited to take this course. I'm delighted to discover Pacemaker as a helpful tool. Oh my goodness, this is the one that Rayanne recommended. So now we're digging deep. We're going to have to rely on Andrew for this answer. My question relates to scheduling, and specifically if you have any advice, this is okay, on balancing creative writing and writing professionally, in my case, academically. Yeah. I find it hard to set a schedule for myself because I need the mental freedom to think and plan both pieces for academia, a monograph in process and several articles, and my novel draft. I find it hard both physically in terms of being hunched over the computer for hours and in terms of having the mental energy to let the creative juices flow, so to speak, for both major projects, novel and monograph. I find it hard to manage longer drafts writing longhand. Any advice for addressing this issue? I think it's a fairly common one with both graduate students and those starting out on an academic career that demands a lot of writing output. I'm assuming the research portion of the course will address later the very difficult related issue of balancing writing and research. Annabelle, I'm going to let you start because you were the goddess of getting writing done in
once upon a time, maybe a long time ago, in Jurassic times.
She's been on leave. That's
before children. So yes, we will be talking about balancing writing and research in very specific ways. So that is coming up in week 5. So that's going backwards through your questions here. Hard physically in terms of being hunched over, you can try a standing desk, and I am not saying that sarcastically at all. I've actually quite enjoyed doing that. If you're Emma Donoghue, you have a treadmill desk. Which explains so much about Emma Donoghue, really.
Yeah,
including why she's in such great shape. But you know, there's ways around that. There's also stuff like Dragon
Dictation software.
Dictation software where it'll learn your voice and speech patterns and you can speak into it and it'll type it out for you. And the more you use them, the more they improve. So those are tools that you can explore. But in terms of balancing, you know, 2 different writing projects at the same time, let's sort of simplify it down to that. That's actually my preferred way of working, because I find if I'm only focused on one project, you can shake your head, you can talk in a minute, Lee. That's my preferred way of working, because I find that if I'm just in one project, I tend to get, you know, you can get short-sighted. It's forest for the trees kind of thing. And I get kind of bogged down and swamped down. But I find if I can move back and forth, and typically for me, it's morning, break, afternoon on something different. And that something different will be nonfiction, or that something different will be children's or YA fiction.
Yeah.
Morning time is adult fiction time, because that's when my brain is clearest. I'm not feeling cluttered. I'm not feeling distracted. And that's when I feel that I need to be most kind of present to do that work. And then, you know, so what you can hear going on in here is you're getting different things from the different writing projects. You're not putting the same kind of energy into both. It's a different process. And it's also very defined writing times. And I found that that's been really useful for me. It's not just I wake up in the morning and say, what am I going to do today? Oh, I'll do 10 minutes on this. Oh, it's not working. I'll go do that. No, I wake up and I say, novel, doing novel, lunchtime, go for a run, come back, work on article, you know, and it's regimented. And I think that that level of discipline is helpful.
Yeah. I think unlike Annabelle, I cannot focus on more than one thing at any given time.
This is so not true. You have no idea. This woman multitasks like a monster.
But one of the things that jumped out at me in your question was the idea of being hunched at the computer for hours. And one of the things I'm going to say is you don't need hours. Yeah. You don't need to be sitting at your computer for hours. If you know what you're going to write, 1 hour can be incredibly productive. So you may want to separate, or you may want to think about separating out the writing and the thinking. If you need to do some real hard, like if I'm going to do a presentation and I'm going to write a script for a presentation, I will often do the thinking through. What am I going to say? How am I going to structure it? What are the points I want to make? I'll do that while I'm doing something else. You know, if you love to walk, that's a great thing to do while you're out on a walk. You can really do a lot of that pre-planning stuff so that when you sit down to write, it's like, okay, it's all there. Boom, 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 boom. So that's one thing, because you shouldn't be spending hours hunched over.
Mowing the lawn.
Yeah, you can mow the lawn, you can do the dishes, you can do there's so much that you can do where you can use that thinking part of your brain. I like to focus on one thing at a time. So like, you know, I gave a keynote at a conference. It took me quite a while to write that keynote, but that was the only thing I was focused on, which meant that I wasn't working on my poetry manuscript. Now I'm back from the conference and it's like, okay, now I'm going into poetry manuscript. And that means I'll probably spend 3 days really hard focus on poetry. Then something else will come up at work and I'll have to write something else for that. And so then I'll focus on that. And that's kind of how I do it. Rather than breaking up my day into 2 parts, I might think more of like a week or 2 weeks, how I'm breaking that time up, because I want to be completely immersed in that world while I'm working on it. But then I recognize I can't work there forever. I have to make tracks on something else that I'm working on. I think it's about tuning into what works for you as a person and what you're able to do. But definitely, you know, the hours hunched over at a computer, no,
that's not good for you. It's not good for you physically, obviously, but it's not good for you mentally or creatively, I don't think.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I have to tell myself that. Like, I have to actually tell myself, Nancy, sitting here and staring at the screen is not going to actually get you any progress. Get up and move around and do something else. And then invariably, bing, that next thing comes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Moon Lake. Outline troubleshooting, thin middle and saggy start. So I came from course 1 and dissected my 2 separate narrative lines, each relating to my male and female main characters.
Yeah.
In terms of the balance between the 3 different acts, and found that for the plot line for my female main character, I have a thin middle problem instead of a saggy middle.
Yes.
Is that an issue in a structural sense?
It depends.
Take that one first.
Yeah, it depends on how significant this plot line is. If it sounds like you've got 2 main characters, so I'm going to say it is a problem. If you told me this was a small little subplot, like
B character,
you know, a real B or C level storyline as opposed to a storyline, that I would say, well, thin middle, you could probably get around it. But if it's one of your main characters, then thin middle is definitely a problem, and you need to find some great stuff for that female character. I mean, it always happens that it's the female characters for some reason. I don't know why, but you need to find some stuff. So the idea is like, what are the challenges, obstacles that this character needs to overcome? What are the 3 levels of antagonism, and how are those going to be dramatized? That's what you want to think about.
Alternatively, do you need that character at all? If you're not finding enough for them to do, well, what?
we're dramatizing your leap.
We're cutting is easier than adding. I'm lazy, man. But I mean, no, honestly, if you're not finding enough for this character to do, are they justifying their presence in the novel? So I think you can always look at a problem in both ways. I had a teacher who said, you always have an option. When something's broken, you can fix it or you can break it more. And, fixing it would be building her up and including all the levels of antagonism, including some more, ways of raising the stakes and different aspects of tension and different conflicts and sort of stage sort of things that can happen. Or you can just say, you know what, thin, I'm going to get them even thinner. I'm just going to wear them down until they're doing the bare minimum that I need them to do. They're not a main character anymore. And that's the way the cookie crumbles.
Well, I think you touched on a good point with that, because I do think beginning writers often feel like they want meaty characters in their novel, and so therefore every character has to have their own POV, and that is not the case.
No.
A character only has their own POV when they have a story, and it might be that this female character is actually a big character in the male character's story, but is not necessarily a character who has a story of their own. So that's something to investigate.
Yeah, and I'm thinking if there really is a situation where you want the characters to be equal, and I'm going to completely just invent a fantasy story here. We have twins in some fantasy world, brother and sister, separated at birth. They each have magical powers. They go off on different paths. One of them's raised in a rich, wealthy household and is given a great education. The other one's raised in poverty and doesn't know anything about their background. And if you find that one story is really thoroughly, the boy's really fleshed out and he's got all kinds of stuff happening, he's making all these decisions, he's coming into all these conflicts, he's meeting all these neat characters, and then the other character is just like, there's not much there. Maybe do an analysis, and yet you can see the way you've structured it. It's bookends. You need the 2 of them to be in lockstep. So look at the way that you've structured your one character, your male character, and just kind of make a list of, okay, what all do I have going on in his life? What are the conflicts? What are the choices that they're making? Like mathematically, how many choices do they make? How many choices does this female character make? How can I bump up those numbers? How can I get a greater sense of balance between the 2 of them?
Mm-hmm.
Is he getting a love story, but she's not getting a love story? Is he getting, I don't know, he goes to a teacher and goes through a whole sort of training montage where he learns to use his powers, and she just never gets any of that. Like, where's the balance falling off, and how can that be remedied?
And the other thing you can ask yourself with that example story is the sister twin really, is there really a whole story to tell there, or is she simply a complicating factor in the brother twin's story? That is, it's the story of a brother twin who was raised in riches and wealth with access to all this stuff, who all of a sudden one day discovers he has a sister. And then that complicates his life. And through his interaction with her, he finds out her backstory. He finds out what's going on in her life. Maybe that's the narrative function. So that's what you need to think about. Yeah. Okay. And then we have the saggy start problem.
Oh, yeah. And so the other part of that was I also seem to have a saggy start problem, as in Act 1 is always about 1/3 of the story for both of my narrative lines. That doesn't seem saggy. I'm writing a fantasy, and in an intuitive sense, I don't feel that my current outline has a saggy start problem, but the numbers seem to tell a different story. Then again, maybe I'm just overthinking it. I think 1/3 of the story for Act 1, that doesn't seem outrageously out of
It's
scale.
a bit long. I mean, that would be in a 300-page novel. Act 1 would be 100 pages, which I think is a bit long. But it just depends on how much you're setting up.
But if it was 80 pages, 75, 80 pages, you'd be like, meh. It seems it's not wildly.
Let us not forget that À la recherche le temps perdu, Act 1 is 60 pages long. So I think it's always good to err on the side of tighter, but I guess what I would look for is there any unnecessary...
I'm going to nod and smile like I've read À la recherche du temps perdu.
Is there any unnecessary exposition?
Yeah.
Is there too much backstory? Those are the things that you could look at paring away. just imagine you have the most intelligent, perceptive reader possible. How many breadcrumbs do they need to get from point A to point B, and pare it back to that? That said, if you pare it all back and you're like, I've still got 95 pages in Act 1, then maybe wait till you're done, and then you'll know for sure, because once you get to the end, you'll be able to reassess the beginning. But also when you get to the point of trusted readers, they'll be able to tell you.
Yeah, but I kind of feel at this early point in the drafting,
don't worry.
You know, don't sweat it too much. I mean, that's not so. If you told me it was 200 pages long to get to your second act, I'd be worried. But this is close enough that I think you can move on and keep going.
I'd say you were George R. R. Martin.
This is going to be a subsequent draft problem, really.
Yeah.
Okay.
This one. So now we've got the troubleshooting of Act 1. So we've got just a quick outline provided of what Act 1 is. And the question was, the question is, I am uncertain if the Act 1 climax is supposed to be the point where the protagonist Sin chooses to take up the invitation to cross the threshold for her sister. Yes, it is, after having read the example. I'm not sure how the taking up the invitation part of the definition for Act 1 climax fits into what I've described. Well, you've actually given us a kind of textbook example where she wants to go find her sister. She meets resistance from everybody else telling her not to go. In fact, the search party itself loses a member, and then they're all panicked about what they should do, because now should they go after the search party member who's gone, or should they go after the sister? And then finally she decides, I'm going to go. That's a classic Act 1 climax.
I will say, in one version, you tell us the character is always ready to cross the threshold. But she's continuously prevented from by other people. And I think you want to sharpen that up as a decision a little bit more by having her maybe initially resistant. I'm not ready to cross the threshold. I'm afraid of what's going to happen if I cross the threshold. I may not have the strength once I've crossed the threshold I can struggle with that. To go and find my sister. And only gradually through the course of that first act kind of realize, actually, I have to do this, right?
And may not still want to.
That makes it a more kind of focused decision, because otherwise the decision is made. I'm going to cross the damn threshold. Get out of my way. Get out of my way. I'm crossing, coming through. And then I cross. Well, that's that decision made on the first page again. And that's less tense for the reader.
Yeah. I mean, you should definitely want it to be a situation where the reader themselves is saying, don't cross that threshold.
Yeah.
You shouldn't cross that threshold. And the character should have those same feelings, right? The character should have that same resistance, and then slowly through the course of those challenges leading up to the Act 1 climax, they should come to the conclusion that that's the only thing they can do.
The Hobbit, the dwarves show up. They say, Bilbo, we need a burglar. Come with us. And he's like, and leave my tea and cheese? No, right? It takes him a while to come around to it, even right up to the last moment. They've taken off. They're underway on the journey. And he's like, no, not doing that. Not going. And then he goes. Right. Yeah. So it's a choice. It's a very defined choice at a very defined moment. And I think that's the only thing I would tighten up in this little
because if you have her starting with like, I'm going to cross that threshold, and everyone's like, no, you're not allowed. We know then she's going to cross the threshold. We already know what's going to happen. Whereas if you create more uncertainty, that's what's going to make the first act climax decision pivotal for us as the reader.
And the emotional state becomes more complex too, because there could be guilt playing into that. There could be fear playing into that. You know, it becomes more nuanced.
It's like, I love my sister and all, but the threshold?
Yeah.
I don't have a sister, you don't have to worry.
I was just thinking of the Upside Down and Stranger Things. I don't know that I'd go to the Upside Down for my sister. So there you
go. There was something about we missed the Deb G.
We did?
We missed, where am I? I'm flipping.
I'm at Vicky Jones.
Vicky Jones. Okay, yeah, sorry. Are we almost, what time is it? We're almost wrapping up?
Almost 2:15.
Oh my goodness. Okay.
We're almost there.
Yes. Okay, let's just rapid fire. Okay. Vicky Jones, these are questions that came up in the discussion, but they weren't posted as Hangout questions, but they came up in the discussion. How does one convey, we'll do rapid fire, right?
Okay.
How does one convey emotion in third person when both protagonists are on their own?
Many ways of conveying emotion. You can do it through body language. You can do it through the sort of the vocabulary that you choose and how it inflects the way they're seeing the world around them. You have a character who's really depressed on their own. Their description of you know, the apartment that they're living in is going to be different from a character who's ecstatically happy and has just fallen in love. Description of the exact same apartment is going to be quite different. So I think it has a lot to do with language choices, particular word choices. I think you're wisely, when you say third person, I'm guessing you're gesturing towards very wisely resisting the urge to go into long passages of internal kind of explaining or monologue. Mm-hmm. That's a good instinct. Don't do that. But in the way in which they act and in the way in which they sort of filter the world for the reader, I think you can inflect a lot.
Yeah, their perception, observation, judgment, that's going to be key.
Concrete sensory detail.
Concrete sensory detail is going to be key. But you can also hint at thoughts and feelings subtly.
Subtly.
Yeah, third person doesn't mean, I mean, I think people associate first person with first person character pours out their emotions, and third person, it's so distant and objective. And that's not true at all. No. There's great emotional access with third person, exactly the same as with first person. Take any first person passage you've ever read and sit down and technically convert it to third person, and you'll see how easily it's done.
How easily you can do that.
Yeah.
Okay, next one.
Okay,
Will David says, can we ever write something that is not ultimately about ourselves? Should we try? And if that is all too revealing and makes you feel a bit sticky, then I apologize.
Honestly, I think this is personal opinion, but I believe everything we write is ultimately about ourselves in some way. If at the very least, it's about what we're obsessed by and consumed with and think about all the time. I could not write anything I wasn't personally interested in. Could you?
No.
Okay.
No. And then the follow-up to that from Mark Loeb. What happens if my inner writing shows too much of myself and people will recognize me or take advantage of my fears and hopes in other areas? And I think that's a really natural fear, that I'm really exposing something of myself in my writing, and people may think less of me when they read the things that I'm obsessed with or fascinated by or care about.
Yeah, but I guess I take heart from what I do is I take heart and inspiration from really courageous writers. Writers who reveal things about themselves that I'm like, oh, I would have never revealed that if that was me. But I think the thing you can see with that is that you can do it and your world doesn't fall apart. You know, if people are taking advantage of your hopes and fears, I would say just cut those people out of your life. Like, that has nothing to do with your writing. If you're around people who are taking advantage of you, that is something that you want to be wary of.
But I also think that there's something there's a dynamic going on in the writing of a first draft that's going to sort of shift as you move through the drafts and as you get later on in the editorial process. In that first draft, you should not be censoring yourself. Maybe you're telling a family story that you know has the capacity to alienate or hurt people around you, and you know you don't want to do that. These are people that you love, and yet you feel so compelled to tell this story. Tell that story. Write that story, the first draft, as though no one else is ever going to look at it. Mm-hmm. Just write that draft. Get all the material out. Once it's out in front of you, then you start to make decisions about, okay, how am I going to shape this? How am I going to disguise this? How am I going to, am I just going to withdraw that because this person is too vulnerable and I can't expose them that way? You make those decisions in later drafts. But in order to really know what you're dealing with and really have the most control over the material, put it all out there in that first draft. Nobody's going to see it.
Yeah, nobody's going to come to your house, ring the doorbell, and say, I heard you wrote a manuscript. I want to publish it, and I'm going to do it without your permission. That's never going to happen. I think it's important. Sometimes there are stories we need to write because we need to get them out. But they aren't necessarily stories that anyone needs to read. I think that's a key thing to remember. Yeah.
Mia Clapton.
There are so many topics I want to address. Toxic masculinity, trauma, memory, energy security, war, conspiracy. Can I reasonably tackle all of these topics coherently in one book? I say yes. Sometimes it feels like I have 3 separate stories swirling around in my mind, but the muses assure me that they are interlinked and must be told together. Write it.
Yeah, I think so too.
I feel like when you list those things, I feel like they do all go together. So,
well, initially I thought you got 2 groupings there. You've got toxic masculinity, trauma, memory, and then you've got energy security, war, conspiracy. But I can see how you can mesh those, right? Yeah. I can see how you have a character in a public world and you have that same character living in their private world, and how those 2 things can be brought together. So I say go for it.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, absolutely. Keep going.
Deb GS. I went back recently to something I'd written for the structure and outline course written by my main character, and was surprised by how strong a voice she had and how unlike me it was. Oh. I wasn't planning to write this story in first person, but now I'm beginning to wonder if I should.
That's exciting. Yes, I'm excited.
Yeah,
I push on.
Give it a try. I found for me, my most successful things have been when I've started with a particular voice or style and thought, I can't keep this up. I don't know how to do this. Like, I love the sound of this, but I don't think I can do this. Those always turn out to be the best pieces.
Yes, because you're risking something.
You're
You're pushing
risking.
into new territory. Yes.
Inga Mufa.
Inga Mufa says, maritime history. Central to the story is a fishing vessel that became part of the Shetlands bus ferrying people and equipment to Norway during World War II. Can the vessel be the story or the narrator, or will it be the characters on board this vessel? Can the vessel be the protagonist?
Magic realism, yes.
And also, I think like stories like the Red Violin, where it's a connecting device for characters as well.
Yes, but I think it's stretching it too far in realist fiction to say that they're the narrator.
Yes.
It's
I guess
device.
so. Yes,
Device
it's a
is the
device.
word.
Yes.
But can it be a narrator in magic realism? Yes, yes, it can.
Yes.
And I would read that book personally. I think that would be interesting. I would.
I do know. I agree. I
There's
agree.
a science fiction story by Cory Doctorow, I believe, called Robbie the Rowboat. Robbie Rowboat.
Yeah.
Robot. But a self-aware boat. It's clever.
Do we have
Andrew
questions
recommends a Cory Doctorow story about a self-aware boat. So there you go. Robbie the Rowboat.
Robbie the
So I don't know what it's
Rowboat.
called. I can look it up.
Robot.
Yes.
Something.
Any other
Always
questions?
with the robots, this one. Any other questions from Internet Land?
Let me just check the name of
He's
it.
like
iRobot.
Robbie the
It's
Rowboat.
called iRobot.
Oh, it is not.
It is.
iRowboat as opposed to iRobot.
Yes.
Okay.
Robbie the Rowboat.
It's iRobot by Cory Doctorow. There you go.
It's online. You can read it. It's silly but kind of fun.
Any other questions?
I'm just going to shake my head.
All right. We're wrapping up. Finally.
We are. And we are going next week into War and Peace, I believe.
Cool.
Right? That's week 2, isn't it? Conflict and Tension?
I think so.
War and Peace?
Andrew's going to double check. All 3 courses.
Yes, War and Peace, Conflict and Tension.
You're going to check it back. Yes, all 3 courses are just mashed together in my head. But there you go. Conflict and tension.
Conflict and Tension.
It's good. It's all where all the meaty stuff happens. I'm excited. So
and that's where we fight.
Yeah.
Next week.
There's going to be lots of conflict and tension between us. And we may be hosting remotely because Andrew is going to be away. So he is going to maybe do some technical wizardry that allows us to join remotely. So if there are some technical blips at the beginning, be patient. We will get it sorted out. Yes.
We always do. Sometimes it takes longer than other times. Happy writing this week. We hope that you enjoy the online material that you will be looking at. And we will look forward to seeing you same time next week. Keep the questions coming.
Yes, these are great questions. Keep them coming.
Yes. Say a big hi to Shireen. And
hi, Shireen.
Happy writing.
Happy writing.
Bye, guys. Bye, Papua New Guinea.